Sentence structure that we're going to cover today includes clauses, fragments, and run-ons. So the very first thing to cover here is that clauses are words, groupings of words or phrases that are used as part of sentence construction. And we have two types of clauses. You have an independent clause, which, as it sounds, can stand on its own. It's a complete sentence. And the independent clause has a subject, a verb, and a complete thought. The dependent clause, like it kind of sounds, is not able to stand on its own. It depends on another independent clause. If it stands on its own, it's called a fragment, not a complete sentence. They are also sometimes called subordinate clauses. They might have a subject, they might have a verb, but they definitely do not have a complete thought. They must be partnered with an independent clause to form a complete sentence. Some examples of phrases and dependent clauses being used to add information to sentences here. The actual minimum sentence here is in red, the boy walked. But that doesn't give us very much information, and we're all about communicating information to be understood. So we add phrases, like the prepositional phrase after school, and the phrase to the farmer's market, and the dependent clause when he was supposed to go straight home, to give us more information. The next one down, Terry carried water, is the minimum full sentence there, and we're adding the prepositional phrase on her head and the dependent clause until she tripped at the bottom of the hill. To get into the nursing program in most colleges, prepositional phrase there, students must complete a course. That is the actual full sentence that could stand alone, but we're adding more. Prepositional phrase in writing, and dependent clause, which is an important aspect of the job. So there are a few different types of sentence fragments that can appear. One type would be an adverb clause. So it starts with a subordinating conjunction, but it does not form a complete thought because that subordinate conjunction is hanging out at the beginning of that sentence. So in red, for all these examples here, those are subordinate conjunctions. And it's possible that you have an independent clause paired up with a subordinate conjunction, but because the subordinate conjunction comes first and it's just one independent clause it's paired with, it creates a fragment. So instead of saying the president arrives, which could be a full sentence, when you add when the president arrives, all of a sudden you're indicating there's more information and it's not a complete thought. So we have a couple examples here. When I walked the patient to the bathroom, comma, she collapsed. So independent clause, she collapsed. Very short, but it has a subject, a verb, technically is a complete thought. We're adding that adverb clause in red that can't stand on its own without that independent clause. And because the dependent clause comes first in the sentence, you put a comma between the dependent clause and the independent clause. Versus if you put the independent clause first and the dependent clause second, that subordinating conjunction ties them together without a comma. The patient collapsed when I walked her to the bathroom. Another type, you have adjective clauses. So they modify nouns and usually begin with a relative pronoun. These are less commonly used by people when they're making sentence fragment mistakes, but it's possible. So for example, that I sold him, you would add that to some type of sentence. The flour that I sold him was $2. So it's clarifying information about the flour. You can't just have that I sold him by itself. Another type would be a noun clause. It names a person, place, thing, or idea, but again does not have a complete thought. Why she said that, whomever you like, you would add that to the sentence. For example, you can invite whomever you like. So it needs to be partnered up with a independent clause. So we have some examples here. The doctor asked the paramedics questions while the patient was transferred onto the gurney. The doctor asked the paramedics questions is the complete independent clause there. The dependent clause is second, while the patient was transferred onto the gurney. And you know that because the subordinate conjunction while is also there. Number 2, you may play outside until the street lights come on. You may play outside, period, can be a full sentence on its own. Until the street lights come on cannot be a full sentence. So that is the dependent clause, and it starts with that subordinating conjunction right there. Number 3, whenever I go to the ER, I end up admitted to the hospital. Whenever I go to the ER, obviously cannot stand alone. Since it's at the beginning of a sentence, it also has a comma separating it from the independent clause. Same structure for number 4. Dependent clause comes first. Sentence starts with that subordinating conjunction since. It is separated by a comma from the independent clause, the full sentence. The job is yours. Same structure for number 5. If you can give me 2 reasons, comma, I will allow it. Number 6, the patient was taken to radiology for a CT scan after the doctors learned she had fallen off of a ladder. So you have the dependent clause at the end of the sentence, the second half, and it is connected by the subordinate conjunction here. The sentence that can stand alone, the patient was taken to radiology for a CT scan, is at the beginning. Number 7, last one. After all the call lights had been answered, dependent clause separated from the rest of the sentence with a comma. Jenna took a break. That is the independent clause. All right, so sentence fragments are not whole sentences. Again, a whole sentence needs a subject, a verb, and a complete thought. So they are missing either a subject, a verb, and or a complete thought. They cannot stand on their own for most types of writing. They're not acceptable. There are some exceptions. For example, if you are a nurse and you are charting, most medical organizations let you chart with sentence fragments. Not all, but some do. But it's usually considered an error when you have sentence fragments in your writing and too informal, etc. In addition to dependent clauses as fragments, you can also have phrases. So, for example, introductory phrases or prepositional phrases. Phrases are little strings of words that give more information, typically about direction, time, or how something is done. So, for example, at the end of the long, windy road, we have a prepositional phrase there. This phrase, running from the police, starts with a verbal. That is a phrase, not a complete sentence. Again, we just talked about the dependent clauses, but they can look very convincing. This is where I most often see people accidentally using fragments, because they often have a potential subject and a potential verb for the sentence and a potential complete thought, but they have a subordinating conjunction that makes it an incomplete thought. So when my toothbrush fell into the toilet this morning has the potential to be a sentence if we just got rid of the word when. And we said, my toothbrush fell into the toilet this morning. Or we could add something at the end of the sentence, when my toothbrush fell in the toilet this morning, comma, I screamed. So those are the ones I most often see as mistakes for full sentences. People don't notice those subordinate conjunctions. All right, run-on sentences are kind of the opposite issue. That's where you have 2 or more independent clauses or full sentences incorrectly joined into one sentence. So there are 2 types of run-on sentences. You have a comma splice and a fused sentence. A comma splice is 2 or more full sentences that are joined by just a comma, which we're not allowed to do, so the comma is splicing 2 full sentences together. Or a fused sentence, where you have 2 sentences that just run into each other without a necessary conjunction or punctuation mark. So comma splices are somewhat easy for people to notice when they're looking for them. You have two full sentences and they are separated by just a comma. So we have independent clause in red and a second independent clause in orange. And for each of these examples, you can see it's a full sentence. I would prefer working on an OBGYN unit, period, full sentence. I like working with babies, period, full sentence. The problem is we have a comma here in between those sentences instead of a conjunction or an appropriate punctuation mark. The other type of run-on sentence is a fused sentence, which has, again, two or more full sentences that are just running into each other. They don't have the appropriate punctuation mark or subordinating conjunction or any combination thereof, putting them together. These are less common that I see, but they can still be an issue. This is why rereading your work is really important, because you would tend to notice these if you review your work. I would prefer working on an OBGYN unit. I like working with babies. Even just trying to say that out loud doesn't work for me. It's really tough. I speed up unintentionally because I want to pause with unit, because I know that's a complete thought, that's a whole sentence, but there's nothing there stopping me. So here are 5 ways that you can fix run-on sentences. You can add a subordinate conjunction, you can add a comma and a coordinating conjunction, or one of the fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. You can use end-stop punctuation and essentially just create 2 separate sentences. You can use a semicolon, and you can use a semicolon or a period, a conjunctive adverb, and a comma. It's a little bit more complex. So if you want to add a subordinating conjunction, you first need to find an appropriate subordinate conjunction. At the bottom are some examples, like after, before, if, than, so, until, where, whether, etc. And the subordinate conjunction needs to match the meaning of your sentence so that you are conveying the correct information. We have a full sentence in green, the subordinate conjunction in purple, and then another full sentence in orange. I would prefer working on an OBGYN unit because I like working with babies. And using the word because indicates that there's a connection there. This one thing is leading to my second thing in the sentence. Remember that you can switch the format and start with the dependent clause, because I like working with babies, comma, I would prefer working on an OBGYN unit. Just remember to include a comma between that dependent clause that comes first and the independent clause that comes second. You can also use a comma and one of the fanboys conjunctions or coordinating conjunctions. And again, those are at the bottom, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. And remember, you have to use an appropriate coordinating conjunction, otherwise your sentence won't make sense. And there are sometimes multiple ones that would work, so you have to pick what you think is best. So for example, I would prefer working on an OBGYN unit, comma, for, I like working with babies. That sentence works. It's communicating the information correctly, but some of you probably won't like that sentence because it sounds a little old-fashioned, a little not common in our speech patterns. So most people would actually prefer, I like working with babies, comma, so I would prefer working on an OBGYN unit. Just because it comes across as a little more modern, more common, and we tend to use that sentence structure more often. However, I would not want to try to use the word but. For example, I like working with babies, but I would prefer working on an OBGYN unit. Well, that's where the babies are, right? So that doesn't make sense. Probably the easiest one is to use end-stop punctuation. Most commonly would be a period, but it could be an exclamation mark or a question mark when you're asking a question. So you have the full sentence, period. Make sure you capitalize the first word of the next sentence and have that full sentence as well. So just adding that period. You can also use a semicolon between the two full sentences, and that is similar to putting in a period, but it shows that the two sentences are related. They're talking about the same thing, so you're letting them share a sentence. You just add that semicolon in. You do not capitalize the first word of the second sentence unless it needs to be capitalized, like a person's name or I, the personal pronoun. Otherwise, you would lowercase it if the word is normally lowercase. One of the more difficult constructions would be using a conjunctive adverb. So we would need a semicolon or a period to end the first sentence, and then the conjunctive adverb, and a comma, and then a full sentence. So I like working with babies. You could do a period or a semicolon. Therefore, comma, I would prefer working on an OBGYN unit. Notice when you have a period, you have to capitalize the first word of the next sentence. If you use a semicolon, you do not, unless the word, again, is a proper noun, etc. And there are a bunch of conjunctive adverbs to choose from, so make sure you pick one that's appropriate. So therefore works with this sentence, thus works with this sentence, but the more common structure and choice we would hear would be using therefore rather thus. Again, most people would consider thus a little more old-fashioned. Not that you can't use it, just less commonly heard these days. All right, thank you.